So the pandemic has been with us for a year, and COVID-19 will change how we live our lives and how we interact with each other, probably forever. But life continues, and while the criminal justice system is trying to find its ways of doing business in the usual way, restorative justice has been rather innovative. It has found its own ways of trying to resolve conflict. We call this now virtual restorative justice. And what does it mean to do restorative justice virtually behind a screen when restorative justice is all about relationships? To explore the topic, I have invited a guest in our RJ webinar series, and my guest is Professor Gabriel Velez. So stay tuned to watch this special episode on virtual restorative justice. So, welcome to the RJ webinar series. I'll just go straight into introducing my special guest, Professor Gabriel Velez. Gabriel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Theo. I'm really excited to be here and honored. And I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education at Marquette University. I really like to say when I sort of introduce myself that I am a former teacher and at heart very much a teacher. So I spent 6 years before graduate school teaching in Harlem in New York City, and then in Peru and in Colombia. And then my studies were focused in adolescent development, where a lot of my questions and research interests developed out of working with young people in those varied contexts. And then lately I've been sort of more focused on restorative justice, and particularly restorative justice in schools and in the Milwaukee area, but also more extensively and more broadly. And I'm excited to talk about some of that today.
And you're also a developmental psychologist, is that correct?
Yeah, and so my work really focuses on adolescents, and particularly around identity development and their understandings and sort of emerging senses of where they belong and who they are amidst their communities and their societies.
And how does a developmental psychologist get to know restorative justice? They get interested in restorative justice.
Yeah, so it's actually funny, as I've gone into it, I've realized that there are very few developmental psychologists, particularly around adolescents, who are involved in this work and in this development of the theory and literature. And I think there's a real opportunity there. For me personally, it was because I've been involved in a lot of initiatives and research around peace education. As I mentioned, I spent some time in Colombia, and my dissertation was based in work there around peace education in the context of the peace process that was going on between the government and the FARC there. And some of that work really touched on restorative practices, restorative justice, because in that peace process, there was a real conversation around restoration as well. And so some of the judicial processes and legal processes that they set up were very restorative focused. And so there was kind of this natural synergy in the conversations I was a part of, and reading about peace education and thinking about how this fit into a larger peace building project in Colombia with restorative justice. And then from there, I was kind of thinking about, well, if I'm studying and interested in how young people are receiving peace education and those kind of initiatives, I started to learn more about restorative justice in schools. And I was like, well, there's a real space here, I think, when I look at the literature, for a developmentalist to look at what are the impacts on young people's emerging identities, their developing senses of morality, rather than the measures, at least here in the United States, that tend to focus on, are we positively impacting their attendance in schools, the school environment, whether there are fewer behavioral referrals, those kind of measures that are not so much about how is this impacting their sense of self and who they are and who they're becoming.
That's very fascinating, especially in the context of our topic today, which is virtual restorative justice. And I've read of it, your work on virtual restorative justice, and Gabriel has a chapter in one of the chapters of the book that I'm editing called Comparative Restorative Justice, just coming out soon and will come up on your screens. But yeah, it's restorative justice is all about relationships, isn't it? And relationships, how far can you take them virtually? I mean, you have, here you are, here I am, we've never met, and we're doing this interview. But restorative justice is all about relationships, and it's interesting to hear from a psychologist, these dynamics and how it actually works, not in a physical presence, but in a remote virtual environment. So really looking forward to hear what you think about that. Yeah, just tell us, first of all, what is this virtual restorative justice? I think one thing that fascinates me about restorative justice, and I've criticized it quite a lot in the past, but one thing that I don't think I can criticize restorative justice for is its innovation. And I've always said that, it doesn't matter what governments or top-down structures will do, communities and people will find a way for restorative justice to happen. And here we are, all locked in our houses and rooms, but life goes on, right? And conflicts continue, and crime continues. So people have found different ways of doing restorative justice. So what is virtual restorative justice?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. One of the things that I've heard different scientists across different fields during this time of the pandemic discuss is how, in some ways, this time has been this sort of bizarre natural experiment. And I want to say that with a recognition of, for many people, it's been incredibly hard, and this is a real reality we're all facing. But at the same time, there have been these sort of new situations and new contexts that we've had to adapt from, or we've had to learn from. And I think for a number of educators, and I speak to educators because that's really sort of my sense of my closest experience with restorative justice, and the depth of my knowledge is really there. They had, sort of their way of doing things entirely pulled out from them. And, there's been a lot of talk about how they figure, how they've worked out trying to teach online, how they've worked out trying to now do the move back to school. But one element in talking to a lot of educators who are doing restorative justice practices in their classrooms and in their schools was that was something they didn't want to sort of lay off to the side. That wasn't something that was less of a priority. And in fact, during the pandemic, as their students became more isolated and struggles with mental health became sort of heightened, they found that this nature of building relationships and finding ways to connect in the virtual space was even more important. And so I talked to a number of educators who said, before the pandemic, I would have never considered trying to get a circle together where everyone is in their homes on a computer. They were just like, no. And I think the pushback on that came from for a number of reasons. One could be generational. When you're talking about being a developmental psychologist and thinking about young people now, there is certainly, on average, I think, a little bit more comfort with kind of virtual spaces for communication and virtual ways of interacting with others and building relationships. And another, which I think is very real and needs to be a part of this conversation, is where the roots of restorative justice lie. And there are many ties to Indigenous peoples and their rituals and practices. And I think some of that comes about with traditionally, these communities were very physically tight-knit. And so, you don't have the option necessarily to be creating divisions and expelling people and creating further animosity through punitive responses when you have a relatively small, relatively tight-knit community that depends on each other. And I think, so that was something that was really at the root and core of a lot of people's thinking about restorative justice, particularly in the school setting. It was saying, okay, so now we have a similar kind of school environment where it's a close-knit community that we have to spend the time together, and we're going to use this opportunity to really build relationships and think about repairing and restoring harm rather than alienating and isolating and dividing. So what that actually looks like. It's kind of taken, I think, many different forms, but the real core that I've seen develop during the pandemic has been thinking about how we can take community building circles and apply those to a virtual space. And so what that means is, how do we create something that looks like people sitting together in a circle, openly discussing, actively listening to each other, and all being sort of involved in this process of respecting and hearing and connecting with others. It basically takes the shape of what might sort of on its surface look like a lot of meetings, a lot of classes where, just like you and I are sitting here on Skype, maybe you have 10 or 15 students in a class sitting here all on Skype, but it's imbued and there's a focus around how do we incorporate some of the key elements that you'll see in circles. So things like turn taking, things even like a talking piece, and they're very innovative ways that folks have adapted that. And so what it basically looks like is moving, for a lot of the core part in schools, moving the circles to an online space, but including some of those key elements And partly that's been because students and educators who are used to doing that in person then look for how can we adapt and apply those in a virtual setting. Now, I'd be happy to talk about some of the innovations, because there is also a space for virtual practices to go beyond that, right? And as you were talking about, not just to be a response and a reaction, but maybe even an extension and an aspect of innovation.
Yeah, and then but I would like to challenge you a little bit and play devil's advocate. Before I do that, I should add that obviously circles is one form of restorative justice, and there are forms like mediation and family group conferencing. And if you're enjoying this webinar series, we have other webinar episodes, and you can sign up on our channel. And you can watch different other practices that we have described in these webinars in relation to hate crimes and domestic violence, the advantages and disadvantages. But I just wanted to challenge you in relation to the actual values of restorative justice. And I think personally what I've attributed to restorative justice is, is the fact that it can bring people together, and through an honest dialogue and communication, remove our hats and share the power, if you like. And through that honest dialogue and the values of restorative justice, we get to focus on the restoration of the harm and what has been done, as opposed to, labeling and focusing on the individual and punishing the individual. And for that to happen, unless I feel something about you, whether it's a good or a bad thing, and then we explode those feelings and we deal with those feelings in person, then I'm struggling to understand how, this virtual environment, which doesn't bring you close to people. In fact, in my view, and there's so much that we can talk about in relation to social media and how people get to know each other, or dating, these kind of new ways of creating relationships. They kind of miss the very important aspect of us being physically in the same space, touching each other, see each other, how we interact, our movements, and the way we smell and the way we talk, and that presence, that physical presence, that has a lot to do with how we we develop feelings for each other. And as a psychologist, I'm not a psychologist, you probably know better than me the importance of physical presence. So yeah, just trying to understand how this underlying values, which assume these relationships, and restorative justice is relational. Is not about the law. It's not about following the law. It's about those reactions to the relationships that we create, or we don't want to create. So yeah, what's your view on that? Having had the experience, as you said, with the schools?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I do want to sort of say that when I talk about this and the development there's been, I think there's still much room for growth, for pushback, for these kind of conversations. And I think what I'm speaking to really is a sense of potential, that maybe there's a possibility here that previously was not even considered. And then sort of because of the necessity of, hey, if we want to do any of this and continue any of this, it's going to have to be virtual. There's been a little bit of a learning process, and I think a little bit of an opening of maybe there's a potential here to do this. But these kind of questions and challenges, I think, are things that need to be researched. There needs to be more empirical discussion of this and sort of evidence. Because you bring up a great point. I mean, we are set up to connect with other human beings through these physical cues, right? And so our senses are not just sight or sound. It is about smell. It is about location and sort of our awareness of the place and how that comes into play in the relationships we build with people in physical space. That being said, I don't think that precludes the possibility of building relationships and connecting and seeing humanity in others online. But I do think that we have to sort of develop and be very thoughtful about how we set that up. But I would say too that's similar in person, right? Because to some degree, when you bring folks together, let's say in a mediation or in a community building circle in a school that's happening regularly, you can't just say, okay, let's sit down and let's talk, and here's a talking piece and go, and then just say that relationships are going to happen, right? And in fact, in some of my work in talking with young folks before the pandemic about their experience of restorative justice, and in this case they're talking about in context of mediation as well as community building, they talked about sort of their sense of that almost alienating them more from other folks, to say, when I'm sort of asked to sit down here and talk with this person, no, like we can't talk it out, and this just made us hate each other more. And so I think that my point there is to say that there are certain aspects about how we set it up and about how we create an environment and an energy when people come together in physical space that's going to help promote those relationships and help promote the ways that our physical being together can understand us as humans and sort of motivate desires to repair and to build relationships. And I think that there is a potential for that in virtual spaces. And I think we need to be at least open to considering what those might look like. And sometimes, that means a sense too of what are the, as I was mentioning before, the innovations or the advantages. And so one, for example, I was mentioned really briefly, was I participated in some virtual circles that were happening last spring, so right after quarantine happened. And one of the things that folks who participated in it talked about was the geographical array of people and the way that they felt like they were building relationships and sort of connecting with people that they never would have before. Because we had someone who was, sitting in their apartment in New York, a student who is, walking, holding their phone in Milwaukee, and then me here in my home a little bit outside. And we would have never connected and touched base before. And so there was a sense that we could transcend physical boundaries in a way that hadn't been able to before. But the other point I'll mention too is a little bit the sense of, I wouldn't quite say it is vulnerability, but openness that can also be brought. And so, for instance, we're doing this webinar here, and I'm just in a corner of my home that I've kind of set up to look very bland, right? But I have other spaces in my home sometimes that I use that provide insight into who I am and make me, in some ways, more a sort of a real person than maybe an in-person context where you see me come into, let's say, a neutral space. And there's a value in that neutral space, but there might also be a value in you getting to see the disarray behind me in my home, or you get to see, what I am in my sort of live space rather than in the neutral space. And so I think, again, like these things aren't settled, and I think that we need those kind of questions and conversations, but I do think there might be an opportunity to really engage with them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And as you were talking, I was thinking, we have captured a lot of learning with the actual, I don't know how to call them, the physical version of restorative justice. And for example, two of the most consistent things that when I participate in restorative justice, I always see is the first question that the victim will ask is why me? And that's usually I would say 90% of the times the question that they would ask. And then at the end, if everything goes well, the most consistent act will be a hug. And that hug, that physical, the touching, or a handshake, a handshake and a hug. For me, that is, I always cry when I see the hug or the handshake. That's when I feel that now we are done, and obviously this physical contact that is so important for, restoring their relationship or just bringing people together, not just in their bodies and in their minds and whatever words that they have shared with each other, but also physically. For me, it's the most important aspect of the whole process, and it always makes me feel, very, very emotional. But we are learning, we have captured those moments, and I'm assuming now that we have this new form, if you like, of restorative justice, and maybe it did exist before, but I think COVID-19 just pushed us to promote it more, and it is the only way because we are locked and we are at home, and we're probably going to see a lot more development of it. And I think the point that you're trying to make, I think, is, as we develop this, I think the academic community and the research community needs to look at it more thoroughly and collect all this, these evidences and learn from the evidences, not be too quick to make claims and assumptions, but learn as we do it, as opposed, and there's a lot more to learn. And I think the examples that you gave is probably going to set a lot of other questions, kind of a knock-on effect. And I would like to ask you, actually, having done this for a few months now, how do you think practitioners would adapt their practice when they bring people together? Because we know the Prof is used to doing this in a certain way, people together, we know the ceremony. But now here you are, you have 5, 6, 10, 20 screens in front of you. How do you adjust your practice to get the best out of it?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've heard from a lot of practitioners is the is the openness to failure too, and the openness to sort of, in a way that if they can incorporate some of that effectively, also an openness to like, we're all creating this space, right? Because another important part of restorative justice is that the participants have a sense of agency, right, in leadership of the process, and it's not sort of being directed upon them. And one of the things practitioners have talked about is being open about, hey, how can we do this here, and sharing in that with those who are a part of it. And so I think that that's something concretely is sort of maybe building out what that's going to look like, because there aren't models, there aren't people who are, very comfortable with this and have a sense of like what might be effective or best practices. And that's part of the excitement that I have of sort of trying to find, and for the chapter we did this, some of the literature that was coming out of practitioners during this last year. Right, so it's not necessarily the rigorous empirical academic studies, but it's practitioners talking about these are some ways that we've done things, and some of the things that have been successful, or some of the challenges. And I'll say, one of the challenges, for instance, is how you get everyone to have their camera on. And I really do believe, as you were talking, there is something really about the physical that is special, but I think you can't have this conversation without having the video being a part of it. Because at least with video, there is some sense of I wouldn't say a physical connection, but of the other person and who they are. And that is something that's coming out of that sort of with these practitioners who are trying it is, I can't make this happen. I can't build connections. I'm struggling if my students don't, or the participants more broadly, I should say, don't have their cameras on. I'll also say that, and this is going a little bit off from your question, but you were making me think of it before, is I think there is space for thinking about what this might look like when we return to the possibility of in-person. And I don't think necessarily we should consider this as an either or a sense of like, oh, we're just going to start doing virtual restorative practices. So rather than having conferences where we bring together a victim and a perpetrator, we're just going to have them in their own spaces and Skype in. I think what we can think about, and you mentioned the word process, is maybe how can we incorporate some of the virtual elements into the process? So maybe we're setting stages, maybe we're building relationships through some of the virtual, and then maybe there is a need for some sort of conclusion that involves a physical coming together. But maybe that virtual part allows for greater flexibility in how we look at the first steps and the first parts of that. And maybe it's an entryway for some to engage in a process, right? So rather than actually having to ask them to come to another space that might be a neutral space, we can sort of lead them in and begin them with, maybe you can start in this virtual way. And one other thing I'll sort of note on that, in one of the ways that virtual restorative justice was being done before the pandemic was in relation to cyberbullying. And so I think there's also space to be thinking about, are there issues and concerns and ways of harm in our modern world that it might actually be most appropriate, or the only way we can really do that is through a virtual means. And so you mentioned about social media, and I'll be honest, I haven't entirely thought this through, but maybe there's a way to take conflicts and harm that happens through social media, through cyberbullying, and might have a person who's in one country and a person who's in another, but we can create spaces to think about how we can repair that harm. And that would require thinking through what a virtual space might look like.
Yeah, and I suppose, like we have, our trainings, and depending on the country, these trainings will be attached to different certification and so on. I think probably now people need to start thinking about training for conducting virtual restorative justice, and what sort of tips and learnings practitioners need to have to do restorative justice virtually, properly, or in combination with, the kind of physical version of restorative justice. I mean, for example, we talked about, the tip in relation to looking at the surroundings. We are in a room. What does that say about you? And I was thinking about that when I was doing interviews for recruiting for people for my organization. And, here we are, suddenly we are in each other's homes. We don't do that when we do interviews. We go in an office, we wear a suit, we wear a tie, and, we don't see where you live. But suddenly I knew that they were in a room, that what that room looked like, probably, gave me an understanding of, who they are. And these things are important when it comes to restorative justice, because I think it all comes down to who we are as people. And that is the difference with restorative justice, I think, and the criminal justice way of dealing with, you know, fixing harm and what we've done to each other, is because it gives that opportunity and that empowerment to that individual. But you can't do that until you get to know the individual and to, you know, to get to know each other and agree and disagree. So maybe, you know, that's something to think about in terms of the training, the capacity building of the practitioners, and, you know, watch this space. Probably I'll come back to you on that. It's an idea.
Yeah.
And it brings us to probably the future and any kind of future directions, and you know, kind of you know, from your research, where do you think this is going? I mean, it sounds very exciting, especially, you know, if you remove geographical, you know, borders. It means that, you know, you could facilitate a case between, you know, a victim and a practitioner and an offender in different countries, in the US and the UK. You know, that's quite exciting, isn't it? But what are also the risks? What is, you know, what is the future?
Sure. Yeah. I think the risk on one level is sort of a general risk of virtual communication and interaction, right? And I think, you know, since maybe the internet began to take off, you know, which now we're talking about almost half a century ago, there's been the concern that people can be anonymous in virtual spaces, right? And I think that's played through in different ways on, you know, whether it be, you know, people targeting others for harm and being anonymous, whether it be insulting others through things like social media and that, but not having the accountability of what it would require in person. And so I think there is a similar concern here of how do you make this about you as a real person entering the space? And so, you know, that was one of the things I was mentioning, like with the cameras, where, you know, there needs to be sort of a basic level of how we think about engagement in this. And so I want to sort of stress that let's not take this too far, as sometimes happens with technology. And, you know, I think the opportunities that are available with online interaction or other things that we say, oh, you know, this is going to be the wave of the future and we're going to have to go this route. I think we've been forced to at sort of a hyperspeed, or I should say practitioners have been. But that then ties, I think, into one of the opportunities, which is we began to do this for the chapter for your volume, but I think there's still really space to be like, how can we gather as a first point, like, what have practitioners been doing during the pandemic? How have they been using virtual spaces? What has worked for them and their feeling? What is not? And then from there, kind of moving that to a next step of, okay, how can we think about research and evaluation around that, right? And then how can we also incorporate the perspectives of those who participate? Because that, I think, is a real critical element that is not always in some of the outcome measures we see. And this is, you know, speaking, for example, to in schools, the ones that I mentioned, right, are about like, maybe there's a quantitative measure of feelings of school environment, but there isn't a lot about like, how are they actually experiencing it and involving it, and why are they engaging in it? And so I think, you know, what we're going to see with the virtual restorative justice during the pandemic is we're going to see a lot of the voices of the practitioners, and that's a good place to start. And we need to think about what they're saying out of that, what they're saying are best practices, what are they saying are opportunities, how can we evaluate and think about that, but then how can we also incorporate voices of those who participated in it, and sort of getting that directly. And then, you know, the other thing, as I mentioned before, is that we've been forced in many cases, and, you know, practitioners both in schools and outside that I've talked to have been forced to at first adapt to the virtual space, and then second to think through sort of a strategy for how can we do this very effectively. But then there will be, once things kind of open up, and I hesitate to say return to normal, but we can have in-person contact again, I think there is a very open question of what are the elements maybe of this virtual that we want to incorporate into practices. And so there's going to have to kind of be a process of figuring out what a hybrid might look like as well. And so I think that's another route for further exploration.
It feels a little bit like back in the 1970s when restorative justice came back, you know, after, you know, I wrote about the history of restorative justice, and I've always said, you know, it used to be in the ancient Greek civilizations, and then suddenly, you know, kingdoms appeared, and the ruler took over, and then kind of it died out. And then in the 70s we had restorative justice, and practice preceded theory and preceded all the policies and the safeguards and all the, you know, the things that we have now, whether at a national or international level, saying what a good practice should be and what the safeguards should be. And it seems now that the practices are getting ahead of of the safeguards, or the structures and the guidelines of doing virtual restorative justice, which is the natural thing to do, because life continues with or without coronavirus, locked or not locked, and people need to respond to the issues and the conflicts. So it is understandable, and in fact admirable, that practitioners are coming up with these ideas and these innovations. The flip side of it, of course, as you said, is that there are risks, and especially when you go online. There is anonymity and so on, and especially when you involve people who are vulnerable, whether they're children or all sorts of vulnerabilities. And this, I think, now this conversation hopefully will start a bigger conversation about accepting this new way and embracing this new way of doing restorative justice, and ask more questions around safeguards, and whether it's at the national or international level, and the restorative justice movement coming together to ask those questions and answer them with honesty, but also with evidences and research instead of claims. And it's fantastic to have somebody like you, a developmental psychologist, to unpack these questions and these ideas. And I think more psychologists should get involved in restorative justice. And I got interested in combining psychology and restorative justice only recently. So my knowledge personally is very limited, but I can see the value that psychology can bring to restorative justice. And I hope that this debate continues. And as I said, all these webinars, we provide them for free. They're online. You sign up to the YouTube channel, the RJ4All YouTube channel, and you get notifications as well when we have new episodes. We hope that they can use them in universities, in lectures, in the workplace. That's part of what RJ4All is about, restorative justice for all. I think there's a lot more to disseminate in terms of information. And one of the things that I keep saying about restorative justice is that, yes, it's a very famous concept amongst researchers and students, but does the public know about it? Do the victims and the offenders know about it? And if it's all about them, it's all about the individual, I think restorative justice should be for all. And that's why I think we should push it more in an accessible way. So, well, thank you ever so much for taking the time to take part of part of our webinars. And I hope, we can do this again in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Theo. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate your perspective. And I think a lot of the work that you do in RJ4All, I've been really impressed about how many different voices, whether they be from different disciplines, thinking academically, whether they be from practitioners, from youth themselves, are brought into this conversation, because I think it's very much in line with restorative practices, but it's also the way that if we want to, build out something that is effective, that is culturally relevant, that is sound in terms of thinking about development, in terms of thinking about building peaceful societies. I mean, all of this, we need that work. And so I would encourage anyone who has been interested in this conversation to reach out to me personally. And, I'm always happy and want to learn and want to talk with those who are interested in restorative justice.
Yeah, and we'll put contact details online for people to get in touch. And obviously this session is also going live, and people can pose questions as we discuss. And once again, thank you ever so much for joining the webinars. And stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.